Hello and welcome to the Hibs Observer Friday debrief with myself, Liam Bryce, joined by a very sleep-deprived Patrick McPartlin all the way from Warsaw, and for the first time in, I was going to say first time in a while, but definitely the first time in too long, by Matty Fairnie to look back at last night's pretty brutal European exit against Legia Warsaw, and for a broader look at this European qualifying campaign as a whole, because if there's one thing it's not been short on, it has been talking points. A real roller coaster for Hibs and David Gray and his players, coming to an end in Poland last night. A 5-4 aggregate defeat to Legia Warsaw after extra time, but I mean that kind of doesn't tell half the story of another pretty draining roller coaster evening for Hibs. So we'll get into all that and more in a moment. Just before we get started, as always, a word for our sponsor. The Hibs Observer is brought to you by S1 Jobs. If it's time to hand in your transfer request, then head over to s1jobs.com and upload your CV today. With thousands of jobs across Edinburgh and the surrounding area, you'll find the one at S1 Jobs, so start your search today. Patrick, better come to you first before you pass out. So you've been over in Warsaw for the last couple of days. How do you sum up? How do you sum up last night and the trip as a whole?
I think we've talked a lot about how Hibs never do things the easy way, to the extent that even the players are starting to say it. And I think for me, that kind of sums up last night. It sums up the European campaign as a whole. Going to Belgrade and beating Partizan 2-0 in their own backyard, and then having to kind of scrape through extra time in the return leg is, I think that's an example of where the Hibs team's at the moment. Like, they never know when they're beaten, but they sure as hell don't do things the easy way. And I think that the novelty is going to wear off pretty soon. So it reminds me of, when you look at a team that's maybe not great defensively, but they're great up front, so they're winning every game, so like 4-3 or 5-4. But I think we saw last night, what this Hibs team is capable of. I think David Gray made a big thing last season towards the tail end of the campaign, talking about the importance of keeping the group together. And they've obviously added a few new faces over the summer who've had a big impact, or some have had a big impact, bigger impact than others. But I think it's one of those nights that you know is going to be talked about for kind of years to come, and not for all the right reasons, because of the outcome. But what we did see was, I think, a Hibs team that looked dead and buried at half time, in my opinion. Come out in the second half and then just in 11 minutes completely turn the tie on its head and keep going for it as well. I mean, Martin Boyle spoke afterwards, and obviously still very raw, the defeat and getting so close to the league phase of the Conference League and then not making it. And he was suggesting they'd kind of gone into their shells a wee bit after sort of going 3-1 up on the night. But I think it was a Herculean effort, a really good sort of battling performance against a side that has plenty of sort of European experience, good at the dark arts, all of that sort of stuff. And the atmosphere was very, very loud. My ears are still ringing from the Legia fans' kind of constant shrill whistling and chanting, things like that. So it's a cliche, but it was a difficult place to go. But Hibs successfully managed to silence it on more than one occasion. And I think it's just, I think we look at it in the wider context. It's this habit of losing late goals has become a bit of a crutch. It's given them a mountain to climb in. Certainly the game against Partizan and then a game against Legia, but it was also, we also saw it against Midtjylland as well. And I think, it's looking at this team and thinking it's probably still gelling a little bit. You've still got some players who are, they've only maybe got 2 or 3 appearances under their belt. They've only had sort of sporadic appearances off the bench, that sort of thing. So I think there's plenty to be excited about for the domestic campaign and obviously the 2 cup competitions. And I think once the dust has settled a little bit, then the general kind of consensus from last night will be that it was like a very good performance from a Hibs side going toe to toe with a side that's got a lot more in the way of European pedigree, and coming very close to, I think we could probably say, causing an upset. I think there was enough of a difference in and the relative coefficients to call it that. But I think, yeah, at the moment it still feels a little bit kind of, there's probably a bit of a shell-shocked feeling for the players and the staff, and certainly the sort of 1,700 or so fans who were there last night, and the wider support around the world. So it's I think it'll be a difficult one to get over to begin with. But I think as time goes by, it will become something that we look back on with something approaching fondness, maybe a little bit like the Ike Athens tie in the early 2000s. I think time will tell on that one. But certainly, as the European campaign as a whole has been really memorable. To be unbeaten away from home against Michelin, Partizan Belgrade, and Legia Warsaw is, if you said that to Hibs fans this time last year, I think you might have been carted off for a closer inspection. I think that's the sort of the overriding thing for me, is just how far this team or how far this squad has progressed, and how far David Gray's has sort of progressed as a manager and a head coach as well. And you consider where they were towards the end of November last year, not even 12 months ago, to be beating Partizan in Serbia and to be going to Legia Warsaw and so nearly causing an upset. I think that just sort of shows where this team has come from, and quite exciting to think about where they could end up.
Yeah. By that same token, I think if you had told people that Hibs would go away to Michelin and get a draw, win over in Belgrade, and then beat Legia over 90 minutes away from home, that would have probably been enough to tip some people over the edge. If you then told them you're still not going to qualify for the group stage after
yes.
that would be an awful lot to take. Matty, I mean, I suspect I know the answer to this question, but is it going to take you a while to get over that last night?
I think so. It's still very raw at the moment. It's one of these ones like I don't know how the players managed to last as long as they did in the conditions that they did, because just watching it, I think my heart rate was like at some ridiculous level all the way through the game. And I texted my son at one point and said, I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of this game with it, just the absolute stress that it was putting on. So never mind participating in it. And then I got up this morning and I was like, I don't know how it feels. Should you be angry that we chucked it? Should we be proud because it's such like a Herculean effort for the players and we ran them so close? But does that feed into the your sort of plucky loser narrative that you sometimes get, particularly like Scottish football is famous for it? And well, pride is the overriding emotion. Like I can't remember a game like that where we've gone to be so written off in it. Yeah, you start that first half, they get the early goal, and you think, well, that's the game done. And really, we showed very little in that first half to suggest we were going to get back into it. And then, there's like an 11-minute spell in the second half, and the whole world gets turned on its head and bouncing about the bedroom. And at 47, that doesn't happen that often. It was tremendous, and I'm just like, we're going to do it, and then you get it whipped away for you at the last minute again, and it was just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. But when I woke up this morning, I tried to assess how I was thinking about it, because I was totally lost for words last night. If you'd asked me last night, I don't think I would have been able to describe how I was feeling, but I think I woke up this morning feeling really optimistic about the season ahead. And almost if you look at that European run as like an extended pre-season, it's like we can start the season properly now without the distractions. And if you were building up your fitness and you had, 3 ties against top opposition where you were going into extra time and taking it right to the wire to get ready for a domestic season, you would think you would be in for like a really good time. And that's kind of where I landed on it. So I obviously gutted by it. I think it'll take a wee while to get past that, but optimism is overriding feeling. I think it's a good comparison to the AEK game that you made, Patrick, because that lives long in the memory, and it was a sort of heroic failure there as well. I think this one's probably up there with it, and almost worse because we had, instead of Luna's header that everybody will rue, we had Boyle's shot. If it was like an inch lower, then we go through, and it's another wonder goal that takes us through. So. Heartbroken for the players, heartbroken for everybody that made it over, and I think most is probably heartbroken for David Gray, because you could see in his sort of post-match interviews how badly he'd taken it as well. But I thought his responses were really good, where he sort of said, like, we'll be proud but never accept the defeat, which is what you want to hear from your manager at a time like that.
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, he very rarely, if at all, doesn't strike the right tone and the right message after these games, no matter how much you can see the disappointment on his face, which, as you say, Matt, you could absolutely see it. He was gutted. The players were absolutely gutted, and no wonder. But Patrick, I mean, talk to us about that 11-minute spell in the second half. What was it like being there for that?
I mean, again, it's like Matty said, it's one of those things where it's really hard to describe what you're feeling, because I think I was doing the live blog, obviously, and I think ahead of Rocky Bashiri's goal, I think I'd said something like, this would be a great time to score, or Hibs have had a few corners, it'd be good if they actually took one of them, and then they did. So of course, half of you sitting there thinking, wow, like this is what a power I have, that I can write something saying it's a really good time to score a goal, and then it happens. But I think it was more just sort of thinking, right, how are Hibs going to approach the game now? Because they just looked so out of it in the first half. I mean, I don't mind saying this. I'm generally quite an optimistic guy, even when it comes to sports and some of the teams I support. I think that's kind of it's a non-negotiable. But I just thought the way Legia were playing, I thought they're knocking it about. They're taking the opportunities when they come. All they need to do is just get like a second goal early in the second half, and then that kind of ends the tie as a contest, and it'll just kind of peter out. So I mean, I got that one wrong. I mean, we'll never know what David Gray said at halftime. We'll never know if the players had some input, or whether it was Legia just getting maybe a little bit complacent almost, and you can maybe understand why they would, because I think Hibs were really. There are a couple of half chances here and there, but I just felt that it wasn't. It was a bit disjointed. It wasn't quite as, kind of free flowing as it has been at times. Not just in European games, but just in domestic games as well. And then, because at that point you're thinking, right, so there's 1-1 on the night. Legia obviously still got the advantage on aggregate, and you think, how do Hibs play this? Do they sort of go hell for leather and try and get another, and then hold out for extra time and penalties? And you think the fact that they went to extra time against McPartlin, the fact they went to extra time against Partizan, you think surely they can't do that again. Another case again is particularly wrong. And I think they scored the second goal, and what sort of struck me the most was that Legia just seemed to completely collapse. They'd been so sort of in control. The first half was just, I mean, it was, you could show it in coaching seminars and just say, here's how to deal with a European game against an opponent who is desperately trying to, make the goals up and things like that. It was just a really, yeah, exactly. Just really, managed it really well, really calm, really, collected, not rushed, not sort of panicky, just, knock the ball around, keep possession, try and take your chances when you get openings. And, if you take some of those chances, then you'll score goals. And I suppose, I had a lot of time to think about the game on the flights back today from Poland, and I almost wonder whether the third goal came too quickly, because it just left Hibs with this kind of, I think it was half an hour or something like that, so it would have been 61st minute, I think. Miguel Chaiwa decided to take matters into his own hands, and I remember looking at it and I remember thinking there'll be time added on, and there was a little part of me that thought it's too soon. But then that was sort of replaced by a feeling that Legia had completely fallen out of the game. I think Eddie Jordanescu made some subs, and it had completely sort of wiped out whatever kind of balance they had in midfield for them to be controlling the game. And it genuinely looked like Hibs could score at any point, any time they attacked. You had Boyle's effort off the bar. You had the effort that Tobias saved with his legs. I think there was a point where a defender just sort of left the ball for Nicky Cadden to go after it, and then the keeper came out, and then he didn't go for it, and there was chance after chance, and you just thought the way that Legia just sort of collapsed, you thought surely Hibs take another one of these chances, and then I know what Hibs we're talking about here, but you think surely then even 4-1 is going to be too much, for Legia to sort of come back into, because there'd just be that sucker punch of thinking, we've got one leg in the league phase. We don't have to worry too much, and then that 11-minute spell, they're just kind of thinking, what's happened? How's it ended up like this? And I think their manager was quite interesting afterwards, and he was doing his post-match. Very very much of a I'm glad we've made it to the league phase, but I don't want to have games of football like this. And he was actually quite funny because he was sort of saying, you know, like, talk to your loved ones, talk to your children who want to pursue careers in football, and tell them don't become a football coach. Because I think he'd probably gone through the ringer in terms of emotions on the touchline. I think, you know, certainly the Hibs coaching staff had as well, and he was sort of struggling for his voice to begin with, which I think probably summed up, you know, his night. But I think I go back to, I mean, it ended up rambling there, but I go back to that just thinking, how do you write about this? Like, where has this come from? How has it happened? Not just the fact
I certainly struggled. I really struggled.
I mean, that sort of feeling of, you know, I've been quite consistent with this and saying that, you know, this Hibs team never knows when it's beaten, and I think my sort of gut feeling going into this game was, you know, it does look like a big task, but if there's any Hibs team from like the past, you know, however many seasons that could do something like this, that could turn it around, it probably would be this team. And I think, I mean, it doesn't come close in terms of magnitude or importance or the fact it was a home game, but Hibs played Astras Tripolis in 2018, I want to say. Went 2-0 down very quickly at Easter Road, and somehow sort of came back in the second half to score 3 goals and win the first leg 3-2, which after a 1-1 draw in the second half, obviously, they progressed to the next stage. David Gray scored on that. And I just kind of think, you know, he's just someone who it never really comes across from him because he's just so kind of level-headed all the time. It's always, you know, what he says, like, you know, never get too high, never get too low. But it was just, it was almost like we were seeing a side of this Hibs team that we hadn't seen before. Like we've seen the sort of, you know, never known when they're beaten. We've seen the like resolute defending. We've seen, you know, the free-flowing football. We've seen the drives from midfield, that sort of stuff. But it was just something completely different. And I think, you know, having Miguel Chaiba on there just as a sort of, you know, a bit of an unknown. I don't think Legia really knew how to deal with him. Now you put Josh Mulligan on top of that. You have Kieran Bowie trying to keep their centre backs occupied. You know, there was just so much to it, and it just, I don't know. It kind of felt, it was exciting to watch. There was an element of chaos to it that you just, you know, that both teams were kind of contributing to, and you just didn't know what was going to happen. You know, somebody could attempt a clearance; it could literally go anywhere. I think there was a period of time where Chaiwa was just sort of like getting the ball 20, 25 yards from goal and just having a go every time, which just sort of seems, I don't know, it seemed appropriate in the circumstances. But I think just it was a mixture of emotions that sort of, you know, this could be an incredible night for the club. Fitting in the 150th anniversary year, it's another kind of feather in David Gray's cap, and, you know, just a sign of how he's growing as a head coach in his own right, especially given it's his first European campaign as well. I mean, I know he's been in the coaching staff, but you know, to be leading the side through some really difficult ties, and it just, I think just one of those where you almost don't know what to think, or there's so many emotions going on, you don't know what one to concentrate on first, which when you're trying to write about it and sort of update people on the fact that there's been a goal is immensely difficult. Because, you know, you could just sort of like, you know, hit the keyboard button bash and, you know, just like those tweets that lower league football clubs do where they just sort of like type a bunch of letters and then say, you know, like, you know, John Smith, that is outrageous, that sort of thing. I mean, I genuinely could have written that. And it'd be nice to be able to sort of put a bit more nuance into it, to put a bit more kind of, you know, description into a bit of colour. But I think the reality is you're just sort of sitting there a little bit stunned. Because it's just so unexpected from, you know, what we saw in the first half, and the fact that it was the sort of 3 goals in 11 minutes, the fact that, you know, it was the nature of the goals as well. You know, Rocky Bashiri, you know what he's done in terms of important goals. Martin Boyle making history, becoming the club's sort of record goal scorer in Europe, and then Miguel Chaiwa scoring, you know, that ridiculous solo effort, and you just think it's just such a Hibs thing, like the whole thing. The manner of the defeat, the manner of the comeback, the everything. And I think that's really the only way you can sort of describe it. I don't think any other club could quite have orchestrated it as Hibs did. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a unique thing. I mean, you know, I know you look at things like, you know, the remontada with Barcelona and things like that, but it's different. It's not the same. Because I think there was almost like an expectation that they would come back and do something like that. So when they did, you're just like, well, we all thought you'd do that anyway. But with Hibs, it was like, well, we didn't know what you'd do. So that's where the difference lies for me. It's just good chaotic fun. You know, I think that's honestly the best way of putting it this week anyway.
It was chaotic and it was fun up to a point, I suppose, for most people watching. I think just the start of the second half, it's just and kind of what followed from there. It just kind of shows you the power sometimes of a team that's got nothing to lose and they've got no other option but to take the handbrake off, and then that can be so difficult for the other team, which obviously in this case Legia, who, as you said, were all about control, all about managing the game. And you can get to a point like that where if you're managing a lead for so long, like the intensity can kind of seep out of your play a wee bit. And then if you're suddenly met with this whirlwind, which Hibs were after the restart, it can be pretty overwhelming, and you can't always just, you know, click back into, you know, for Legia, like going back to full tilt. So it was a kind of perfect storm in that sense for Hibs. And it was the right thing to do. They had no other option at that point. They had to go for it. And then those changes early into the second half, I think obviously, you know, Miguel Chai was the one who's sort of catalysed it, because he not only does he score that goal, but I think from the minute he came onto the pitch, he looked like a guy who was just determined to make things happen. And it's the kind of old cliche about having somebody taking the game by the scruff of the neck. But I think that's probably such an apt description of how he played when he came on, because certainly I don't know if it was the first thing he did when he came on the park, but the thing that kind of made you kind of first sort of sit up and take notice is he got the ball in his own half with a man at his back, and this easy thing and probably the safe thing and probably the coaching manual would tell you to just, you know, don't take any risks in that situation where, you know, in that area, because if you lose the ball you're in trouble. You know, just find a pass and you can play out the other side. But he dropped the shoulder, turned the man, and kind of just drove over the halfway line, and he got Hibs about 40 yards up the pitch, and nobody had really done that in the first half. You know, nobody had really, to my mind, had really had that kind of mindset, or certainly, you know, they might have had the mindset but just hadn't been able to do it. And it just kind of changed the dynamic of the team right away, because then now suddenly they were moving into space, they were getting into the Legia half, into their final third with a lot more sort of regularity than they'd managed in the first half. You know, it's that way where, you know, he turns, he drops his shoulder, he takes a man out of the game, that drags other people out of position. It's not, you know, then you're going into the Legia half faced with them in their shape. He just caused a wee bit of chaos, which was, I think, is exactly what was needed. And Matty, I think, obviously you don't want to. He's been really impressive, and that goal was a moment of absolute brilliance. And you never want to go too early on a player when, you know, they've only had a handful of games. But he has been very impressive so far, and his impact last night was just transformative on that second half.
Yeah, he was brilliant. His debut against Livingston, he stuck out like a sore thumb with how good he was and how much he impacted the game. And you're absolutely right with what you're saying about a player taking the game by the scruff of the neck. I think that first half, if you look at it, I don't think Hibs had anybody that was really shining in the game. We maybe had players at 6 and 7 out of 10. Like we were all right, but not really good. As soon as Chaiwa came on, we've got an 8 or a 9 or a 10 out of 10 almost, you know, in moments of his play. And that lifted the players around. So all of a sudden, Bowie's playing better, Boyle's playing better, he's more involved. We get the goal, you know, like the whole team's performance is lifted for that sort of injection of energy and quality. And just like the momentum's massive in it. I said at half time, when you watch the coverage, they interview the goal scorer, the Legia goal scorer, and he's all smiles and relaxed, and his head's already in the next round. And then you see the team about to come out at half time, they're all milling about in the tunnel, and their heads are all in the next round. And I said to a few friends I've got on WhatsApp, like, if we get a goal, that'll rattle them, because they're not expecting it. They think we're down and out at this point. And so I think when we had that sort of whirlwind start and we had the momentum and we got the goal, and then the second one right after it, they had no idea how to cope with at that point, and they totally lost the head. And so we get the momentum. Chaiwa scores that like a wonderful, wonderful third goal. And and it looked on, for a while. You couldn't really see at that point how Legia were going to get back in the tie. It was going to take something, either us tiring, as happened. They kind of pushed it right to the end and threw the kitchen sink at us, or something like Hoylett's red card. If that had stood, I think that would have changed the game as well. But I think you give Gray a load of credit for sort of spotting what was needed, but lifting the players to get that performance, that lifting performance for the second half was massive. But to answer your question about going earlier on Chaiwa, I'm quite happy to go earlier, and I think he's Ballon d'Or sort of material at the moment. I don't know how he's ended up at Hibs. Like it's outrageous.
He was excellent, and he's one of the. I mean, as I said, like oftentimes you don't want to go too early on a player, but sometimes they leave you with no choice, and he's been really, really impressive with everything he's done. I think maybe a couple of times, the only, if there was any, you can't really criticise him too much, but a couple of times maybe just a wee bit too eager at times in that second half. I remember one point he tried to shoot from 25 yards for about the fifth time in half an hour, and there was what you could see David Gray on the sidelines like telling him just to like kind of hang it down a wee bit. But I think when you're in the moment and you're having such an influence, he probably felt like he could do anything at that point. So it's hard to begrudge him that. But he has kind of offered something completely different in the middle of the park, and it looks as if Hibs have found themselves a really, really good player there. So I mean, the ending, we've kind of touched on it a wee bit there. But I mean, we've talked about this kind of trend of late goals, but I mean that one. To me, it maybe looked as if there was maybe just one too many players that were just a bit knackered, and they just, what happens when you get to that stage, the concentration can go, the legs can't do what they could do an hour before, and it seemed like there was maybe a bit of fatigue kicked in towards the end, because it was a long night, wasn't it?
I think what there's a wee change in shapes. We take Boyle off and Megwa comes on. I think Megwa tucks in rather than going out to the crosser. I think Levitt switches off a wee bit as well, and it's just the tiredness. I think Levitt gets a shout to follow the runner, and he sort of tries to pass the man on. And I think his race was run at that point, and you've got the sort of the physical and the mental fatigue, and you have to remember like how hot it was in the stadium, the quality of the opposition that you're up against, and just sort of withstanding that pressure as the game goes on. It gets harder and harder and harder, and I think it's frustrating because it happens a lot, but it happens a lot because of the quality teams we've been up against. I think I don't think it's a Hibs thing necessarily. I think if you put loads of teams in that situation against that quality of opponent, where it is something that's better than you, something gives, there's only so long you can kind of hold out. And it's just unfortunate. Like, you're almost got to, I think this fact it was 7 minutes injury time gave them a lift as well. And that 7 minutes comes from the referee's mistake with Hoylett. Had it been a 3 or 4 minute thing, I think we go through, because that doesn't feel like enough time to go and create something. You see 7 minutes going up and you think, oh, brilliant, that's a good chunk of time to get back in.
There's a psychological element there.
And I think for the Hibs players, you see the 7 minutes going up and you're like, come on, man. So I think a combination of factors. There's a bit of chat about whether it was the right sub to bring on Megwa when you've got Hanley on the bench. Like maybe that wee bit of experience might have helped out, but I'm kind of loath to criticise it because it's all what ifs. You don't know what might happen. You could have chucked Hanley on if he scores an own goal and then everybody moans about that. Or it's just we could deal with what did happen. There was mistakes made. We were punished. That happens at that level. We just have to kind of get on with it, don't we?
I suppose. Patrick, I mean, once the inevitable disappointment and the hurt from that wears off for Hibs, do you think this, even though it's ended in disappointment, do you think this whole experience sets them up well for domestic duties now?
I think it does, yeah. I think there'll be a little bit of a feeling that they came up short, but they were in a great position to change history in a positive way, as David Gray keeps talking about. And it would have been monumental financially. It would have been a huge thing historically as well, as we were discussing. And there is also that sort of the unknowns, like would that then have had a serious impact on domestic form, like league form and things like that, because that's that's where I feel like Gray's been quite good at getting that balance right, where if you think about the last time Hibs were in Europe, even if they were getting quite good results on the Thursday night, they were pretty abysmal on the Sunday. In the league, I think with three straight defeats to St Mirren, Motherwell, and then Livingston, which ultimately cost Lee Johnson his job. So I think Gray's been really good at sort of juggling how to play the domestic games at the weekends and how to play on the Thursday night. And I think for the a lot of players were playing in Europe for the first time. Whether it's because they're a younger player, whether it's just because their careers so far haven't taken them to a club that is going to get close to Europe. I think that a lot have had that taste for it, and I'll just think this is where we belong. We've shown we can compete. We've shown we're not out of place. I mean, Gray said that in his post-match as well, that he felt Hibs had been outstanding in Europe, and they've shown that they belong with that sort of with those teams. And I wouldn't disagree. I think there's still work to be done. But when you consider how European football's changing, and what we're seeing with teams who previously haven't ever really got beyond the qualifying rounds are now starting to make the groups or the league phase. It's certainly something. It's another target for them to try and get to. But to do that, you need to be strong domestically. You need to go well in both cup competitions, particularly the Scottish Cup. It sort of feels a little bit like this was a chat last night. It's like, if Hibs want to get to this stage again, then I think they have to finish third and win the Scottish Cup. Just for that kind of belt and braces approach. Because that's the other thing that we've not really discussed in the the sort of wider context of this European campaign is that if Celtic had won the Scottish Cup, then it would be, I think, a very different feeling, because then you would have had the guaranteed league phase football. And I think that probably added to how sort of gutting it was last night for for the players and for the fans, that I don't think too many non-Hibs fans had sort of given the team much of a chance of making the league phase, just because having to sort of go through a Europa League qualifier, and then if you lose that, you drop down to the Conference League, and then it's who do you play in the Conference League? You get drawn against Partizan, they get drawn against Legia. So I think there will be that determination to kind of go one better next time. And I think when you look at the likes of Kieran Bowie sort of being fully fit now and having had a proper pre-season, you look at some of the the signings they've brought in, how well they've done so far, even in sort of brief appearances. It sort of does seem to be set up for Hibs to have a really good domestic season again. I mean, the unknown obviously is that you look at last season with that sort of awful start, followed by the 3-3 draw with Aberdeen, and how that sort of changed the entire course of the season. But Hibs have started off pretty well domestically. I think it's just about how do you maintain that? How do you keep that going? How do you sort of channel the kind of the emotion, the psychological factor from the European games into domestic games? Because that's what's going to help the team keep going, and to try and reach sort of like targets that they're setting themselves. So I think you look at the squad. Obviously, we've got transfer deadline day on Monday. Please make all this football stop. It's too much. But I think the squad looks in a really good position. I think when you're able to have an argument about, do you start Miguel Chaiwa, do you start Thibaut Cliche, do you bring Grant Hanley on, you bring a Scotland international with 60 plus caps on in the second half of the European game. With what a kind of dilemma for David Gray to have. And then sort of weighing up, like, do you put Mickey Cadden at left wing back? Do you put Jordan Abita there? Do you put Abita at left centre half? There's so much for him to kind of choose from that I feel, that again was probably a problem in the previous time when Hibs were juggling Europe and domestic football, was that they just simply didn't have the squad or the personnel to be able to do that. And I think we've seen evidence so far that they do. And I suspect there's probably a few teams in the Premiership who are looking at how Hibs have performed in Europe, how they've performed domestically, and now think, I think you'd be naive to think that Hibs will sort of take the European exit hard and kind of go on a sort of a bad run of form or anything. I mean, obviously it's football, anything can happen. It's Hibs, so anything can happen. But I just don't think Gray would allow that. I don't think he would stand for that. He obviously has his standards, he has his expectations, and I think that he'll just be saying to them, look, you did very well to get to the stage last season when everybody had written you off after 14 games. Now you've got a chance to go and prove that it wasn't a flash in the pan, it wasn't a fluke. That Hibs do belong in European competition, and they can sort of fight to get sort of back-to-back third place finishes. So yes, the European dream is sort of out the window, but I think there's still an awful lot more to play for. And I think from what we've seen in these early games, it's shaping up to be, or it should shape up to be quite an exciting season. I think a lot of promise in some of the younger players, a lot of good signs from the signings, and then holding on to those key players from last season as well. It's just a really nice blend. There's no the team doesn't need time to gel, don't need time to get to know each other. It's just kind of pick up where you've left off, and see where that takes you this time.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say, I mean, it's obviously you can't predict with absolute certainty how the domestic season is going to pan out, but I do think the signs are good, and I think in each of the domestic games so far, I think you can see there's been a confidence about Hibs. I think you can really see that in the play. I know what happened in the second half against Kilmarnock, that wasn't great, but I think in general, in the 3 games, there has been a confidence about the team, and it's hard to think that that's not a direct consequence of going toe-to-toe with these teams in Europe, and despite the results in the end, really taking a belief from that. But just to finish up, Matty, I mean, St Mirren on Sunday, I think I'm right in saying St Mirren the only team in the Premiership that Hibs didn't beat last season. Mm-hmm. So you could say due a win, but I don't think you can take anything for granted when you play St Mirren these days, can you?
No, they're a good team. We saw obviously champions-elect Hearts get knocked out of the League Cup for them the other week. So you can't take it for granted. I think they're a really well organised team, but everybody says that about St Mirren. I think that does them a wee bit of disservice as well, because they're more than just an organised team. They're a really good team, really effective at what they do. I think the fact they went to extra time and we've got the travel back probably doesn't go in our favour as well. But we do have options. We saw it against Livingston when Gray sort of changed the team up quite a bit. We had Manny and Chaiwa running the midfield. Where they came in at sort of out the cold. Now, obviously, Chaiwa played his part last night, but didn't play the full match. So we might see that sort of shift in personnel again and freshen the team up. And I think we're good enough to do that. And what I really hope is that we've got a big crowd there and everybody sort of gives the players the reception that they deserve, get right behind them, and the players have a real sort of sense of wanting to put things right from Thursday night and really going at it and making sure that our league season kind of kicks off as well as it can.
Yeah, I think they certainly deserve a big crowd getting behind them on Sunday for what's going to be a really tough game. And so this is it from now. I mean, it was as enjoyable as that was for the most part, I think, for all involved. It's over to the sort of bread and butter now, if you like, and it's I think there's going to understandably be an awful lot of optimism around it, but for now I think we're going to leave it there, folks. We'll let Patrick get to his bed. But yeah, thank you for joining us. I know that's a sore one last night, so hopefully it wasn't too traumatic to sit here and relive it with us. But we'll be back over the weekend with some more follow-up from the game and obviously our usual coverage from Easter Road on Sunday. So thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Matty. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. We'll speak to you again very, very soon. We hope you have a good weekend. Cheers.